Good afternoon or good morning, depending on when you're watching this pre-recorded installment of our Roads to Research speaker series. Thank you for joining us. On behalf of Royal Roads University's Office of Research Services, I would like to acknowledge that Royal Roads University rests upon the ancestral lands of the Krause and Lekwungen nations. I'm speaking remotely today from the traditional land of Lekwungen. And I invite everyone who's listening to take a moment to think about the land on which you're living and working, and to acknowledge that land and the traditional people of that territory. Thank you so much to our presenters for making the time for their presentation entitled Indigenous Alumni Survey. Christine Webster is an RRU alum, and Kathy Bishop, Wanda Krause, and Elizabeth Hartney are all core faculty from RRU's School of Leadership Studies. I'm going to hand it over to you. Finally, I would like to thank also the Canadian Tri-Agency Research Support Fund for their support of this speaker series. Thank you. Over to you.
Thank you. Good afternoon or good morning. My name is Christine Webster. I am Newchannel from the Housing Nation.
And good morning or good afternoon. I'm Kathy Bishop, and my ancestors immigrated from Scotland, Poland, and the Ukraine. I was raised in North Vancouver, and although Vancouver Islands claimed me about 27 years ago, so I do have the privilege to live, work, play on the traditional lands of the Kasepsan and Lekwungen families for the last 5 years. I'm core faculty in the School of Leadership Studies.
Hi everyone, I'm Wanda Krause. I'm the program head of the Global Leadership Program in the School of Leadership, and very happy to be joining you from the traditional lands of the Kasepsan and Lekwungen. And I've grown up in the Yukon, so that's what I call home, even though I am located here, and have also lived mostly abroad, Europe, and mostly the Middle East.
Hi everyone, I'm Elizabeth Hartney. I grew up in the UK. My father's ancestry is from Ireland, third generation living in the UK, and my mother's family come from Canada, specifically. She grew up in the northern part of Vancouver Island, and is of white settler descent. Very pleased to be joining you today, living on the traditional lands of the Kasepsan and Lekwungen peoples.
As mentioned, we are delivering our presentation from the safety of our homes. We hope that you are all doing well and staying safe as well. We too would like to acknowledge with respect the traditional lands of the Kasepsan and the Lekwungen families, of which the Royal Roads University is situated. The families continue to have that relationship with the land to this day. We're here to talk about the Indigenous Alumni Survey and a little bit about my thesis, of which it is tied. Kathy will walk us through the agenda, and then Elizabeth will start us off with a little bit of background to the project.
Lovely, yes. We're definitely delighted to share with you the dual research projects that we engaged in last year. And so today's agenda will be, well, we've done the welcoming introduction, we've done a territory acknowledgement. As Christine said, Elizabeth is going to start us off with background to the project. I'll give a bit more of an overview. Then Christine will step in with a deeper dive into the methodology findings and conclusions. And Wanda will bring it together with the recommendations, and then we will share some stories and end with a call to action. So we invite you to sort of sit back, enjoy, and join us on this journey.
So I'm just going to touch on a couple of pieces around the background. I think there was a lot that kind of led up to this particular project. but for me specifically, it emerged from my experiences as a program head on the MA Leadership Health Specialization program, and my teaching experiences of supporting Indigenous students. I have been collaborating on both on research and on student support with Asmanahai and Juan. And in our conversations, we recognized that often we were focused on supporting students who were having difficulty because they, for whatever reason, were not experiencing cultural safety at Royal Roads University. So whether that was emerging from experiences with other students, or interactions with faculty, or from their experiences of being on campus, or kind of the language that we use. For various reasons, these issues will come forward, and part of the shortcoming of informing ourselves in that way is that we didn't really get to hear from the students who hadn't experienced challenges to the point where they were bringing it forward to program head or student services, and we also weren't hearing anything about what we were getting right. So Asma and I had conversations about ways that we might be able to engage the broader community of Indigenous alumni who had been through Royal Roads over the previous 20 years, to hear about, you know, what had fitted well for them, what hadn't fitted well, what they felt that we did, in order to better support all of our Indigenous students, as well as supporting our broader student and faculty community at Royal Roads around the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission's report. So, so really there was a lot of background thought and conversation that led up to this. And where it kind of started to be conceived as an idea for a research project was during a one-day school retreat that I took the lead on participating within our School of Leadership Studies, focused on Indigenous issues. All of the faculty had experiences with Indigenous students that often had been, you know, bringing forward various areas that we felt needed development. So there was, during the course of that retreat and the cultural safety training that we had, and the conversations we had about how we could move forward as a school, one of several ideas that came out of that discussion was to apply for the Butterdall and Skeen Learning and Teaching Innovations Fund to bring this idea of a survey of the alumni into reality. And I was absolutely delighted to receive support from both Kathy Bishop and Wanda Krause, who bring a variety of different experiences and skills and expertise to this, which obviously they'll speak to when their turn comes around. But we decided to apply for this funding, the three of us. I took the lead on actually conceiving, designing the project and writing that grant application with a view to supporting initiatives that enhance the professional growth of faculty as a whole, enhancing teaching at Royal Roads University, and serving a strategic function in highlighting faculty members' contributions to the success of the university. So they're really the purposes of the Butterdall and Skeen Learning and Teaching Innovation Fund, which provided us with an opportunity then to engage with a student, an Indigenous student, who could take the lead on this. There was a real recognition during the conversations we had at that retreat that as, you know, non-Indigenous faculty, we really didn't have that lived experience, and there are probably, you know, most definitely unconscious biases that we hold that could impede the representation of the views of our alumni. So, you know, what was built into this was an opportunity to, you know, respectfully engage a student who could then use this as the basis for their thesis, and could really take the lead on developing this in the way that they believe it should be done. So we were absolutely delighted when Christine stepped forward to do that, and I really acknowledge that this whole project wouldn't be what it is without Christine's leadership. And so with that, I'm going to hand it back to my colleagues.
Lovely. So this is Kathy Bishop again. And so just to sort of, give you an overview as Elizabeth, shared the background, then I came in and, took the lead in terms of working with Christine and the team in terms of not only taking forward the Indigenous Alumni Survey, but then being faculty academic supervisor for and with Christine. So to start, as Elizabeth identified, there was a real intention to explore and improve the experience of Indigenous students at Royal Roads University. And so for this particular research project, the purpose was to develop a survey tool to evaluate Indigenous cultural safety, supports, and opportunities for learning Indigenous perspectives in our school, and ultimately, to take that at the broader post-secondary education level. And then to report the results of the survey in order to provide valuable feedback about how to develop programs, incorporate the wisdom and insights to better meet the needs of Indigenous students, again, here at Royal Roads and potentially beyond as well. And so with this, as we move forward, there were 6 strong objectives that were identified, and that was to build an accurate understanding of how Indigenous students experience Royal Roads, to identify appropriate language to use in relation to Indigenous issues, to identify strengths in the current programs that we have for Indigenous students, as well as to identify challenges and some of the barriers that students experience around cultural safety and others. And then also, of course, to develop new approaches to supporting Indigenous students and to identify appropriate directions for curriculum development and enhance the overall learning experience for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, which would include Indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing within, most particular, the School of Leadership Studies. And you'll see how that happens because Christine was doing her Master's of Arts in Leadership with us at the time. So in terms of, speaking to the overall project development, it started as a standalone project, but it quickly moved into a dual research project. And so when I had drawn up the ethics application, I needed to include both the questions from what we were doing as co-investigators with Christine as a research assistant, although as you can hear, she quickly took the lead and we were able to, work with and support her in that process. And also in her own development of her thesis work. And so the first question that we focused on for the Indigenous Alumni Survey was, how can Royal Roads University enhance its cultural safety, supports, and opportunities for learning Indigenous perspectives in a post-secondary education? And then where Christine zeroed in on was, how can the School of Leadership Studies Master of Arts and Leadership program enhance the overall learning experience for Indigenous students so that they feel that they're being true to their Indigenous values while being in the academy? And so, as you've been hearing, Christine took a very important leadership role, as Elizabeth identified, as the Indigenous Alumni Survey co-investigators team. We really trusted Christine as well as the Indigenous elders in the study that she engaged with, along with ASMA, to support and lead in this process. And then in terms of the process, where that happened in terms of our grant application was around the survey development. And then Christine furthered that with one-to-one interviews. And around building language, what I really appreciated was how Christine built in to her own thesis work, re-looking at appropriate languaging around knowledge sharing providers, knowledge gathering, knowledge gathered, sense making, and offered gathering. And so, not to speak on Christine's behalf, I'm going to turn it over to her, but I just want to acknowledge one of the many things that I did appreciate Christine in terms of her leadership and how she moved forward on this. So Christine, I'll turn it on to you, over to you to go deeper.
Wonderful. Thanks so much, Kathy. And thank you for all your kind words that you're sharing. The work that I undertook was really guided by the work of other Indigenous scholars that really helped place me as a New Tonalth person in grad school. In particular, Linda Smith wrote about methodology, that it is important because it frames the questions being asked, determines the set of instruments and methods to be employed, and shapes the analysis. And so when I took those words, I thought about how I would move forward in the project. And the first thing that I did was I met with the Huron people, and it's a group of local Indigenous elders and old ones who advise on Royal Roads community Indigenous specific matters. So I presented to them with what I had in mind for moving forward with the Indigenous Alumni Survey, and was seeking guidance and help and just someone to talk to about how I was going to walk through the journey. And two offered to, they self-identified to help me with this project. Initially, the Indigenous Alumni Survey didn't sit well with me as a method because it didn't feel true to me as an Indigenous scholar. But when I reflected on how I began this, I just said that the Indigenous scholars really helped ground me in my work. And so when I thought about the intention of the knowledge we were trying to gather, I took the Indigenous Alumni Survey responses as written story from the Indigenous students. And so one thing right off the bat that I kind of got questioned on is like, how does an online survey fit within an Indigenous methodology? And so I just want to be transparent about how I took the Indigenous Alumni Survey responses as written stories from the Indigenous students, alumni, and current. Actually, there was current students that also participated, which I'll speak about in a moment. So when it came to developing the questions, I took a first shot at it. I bounced it off some colleagues that were in my cohort. I brought it to the self-identified, self-selected old ones, and we talked them through. It was a really neat process to actually sit with them and talk through the questions I was asking and why I was asking, and they were storying about what the questions meant to them. So it was a really important piece of the process as far as survey development went. The questions also went to the co-PIs and my partner organization and Indigenous education, student sports, various levels within the university had their eyes on the survey and provided some feedback that was really valuable in moving it forward. We had lots of help within the Royal Roads community, which was so great. Of the survey responses, we had 23 out of the 175 that we sent it out to. But as I mentioned, I also sent it out to current students of the School of Leadership Studies, and I had 6 responses from there. Another method that I used, now this is tying into my thesis work, was that I had one-on-one discussions, also known as interviews, but it just took out the formality by describing it differently. So this was gathered from 7 knowledge providers who responded to the interest that the email that I had sent out. 4 of them were female, 3 of them were male, so it was diverse. There were 5 from within the School of Leadership Studies. 4 of them were alumni and 1 was a current. 2 of the alumni that responded for my one-on-one discussion were from other fields. There were different modes that we had these conversations. 2 of them were in person, 2 of them were video conference, and 3 of them were phone calls. Those were the 3 modes. And then the meetings lasted between 35 minutes and 180 minutes. Definitely can say that the phone calls were the shorter and the in-person meetings were longer. Just that face-to-face relationality of it really impacted the conversation. The reason I share about the one-on-one interviews is that it really helped understand some of those written responses that were gathered in the online survey. Although many of the people that I spoke with had apologized for not participating in the survey. So I knew that some of the information was not repetitive and definitely held value and merit. So then I went on to the sense making, or also known as data analysis. Not quite yet. Thank you. The first one was the anonymous online survey. So I took an initial read of all the responses with no note-taking, just took it all in one sitting and just wanted to really feel what the responses were saying to me. This then followed up with like a cutting and sorting technique where I was highlighting themes, I highlighted words, I was just really trying to sit with it. And one of the things that was really important for me, I don't know how to get it across better, but I really needed to stay in the moment with all of the information. So it took a long chunk of my time to go through it, and not just one time. I kept going back to it and sitting with it and reading it. And then when I had a good understanding of what was coming through, I met with the old ones and reread the question to them, gave some of the examples of the response, what people were saying, like the themes that were coming out of it. And we also had a little discussion about what that meant. When it came time to do the one-on-one discussions, I provided transcripts to each of the knowledge sharing providers, and they wrote back. Most of the things that they wrote back with were the incorrect spelling of like ancestral words, and that was a good process to make sure that I was really capturing accurately what they were conveying to me. I sat with it and also did another sort of cutting and sorting technique, theming of topics that were coming out of the discussion. And then I started to pull quotes that were really resonating with me. And I sent those quotes to the knowledge sharing providers, participants, for their validation that yes, it was okay, I took it in the correct context, and that I was okay to continue using their words within my thesis. So here's where I'll just take a pause and go further into the wording that I chose to use within my thesis. Knowledge sharing providers was the participants, knowledge gathering, knowledge gathered, sense making, offered guidance. There were different words that I used also within the thesis. That was, as an example here, the English words in place of other English words, but also I used Nuu-chah-nulth words in place of English words. And it was just, again, sitting closer with the intention that I was bringing forward in my writing and trying to describe closer to the experience of what I was going through. And the offered guidance, just one more note about that was, I used that really particularly because I wanted to make sure that it was taken as a starting point for the organization to consider ways of bringing in some of the recommendations, and that it wasn't just, here's a recommendation, you can do it and then tick it off your list. It was more offer guidance of here's a way that you can consider doing this, for example, Indigenous content, or other Indigenous theory and practice within their offerings, the course offerings. So then I'll just move to the next slide here. Out of the responses from both the online survey as well as the one-on-one discussions, I produced the summary of findings, and some of the strengths that the Indigenous students talked about were the real-world application of the curriculum, meaning that they could take what they were receiving and bring it into their workplace live as it was happening, and they found a lot of value in that. The positive relationships that were developed through the cohort model, both instructors and the cohort were mentioned in the Indigenous Alumni survey, as well as the one-on-one discussions. The current endeavors at inclusion of Indigenous reflections. So they valued the welcome, the territorial acknowledgement, the fact that there was an Indigenous service provider on campus. And then the program design of the online and on-campus component really was a strength as far as valuing the balance between work, home, and school life. And then the transformational experience, that people were just really impacted with the program, or the program that they were in. Some of the areas that were identified for improvement were greater inclusion at Indigenous content, theory and practice. So although there's a welcome, or although there's a territory acknowledgement, how do you bring in more informed content within each course? And then increased Indigenous community involvement within the delivery of the curriculum. Sometimes it's important to bring in the words of those that you're speaking of. As Elizabeth mentioned earlier, the whole idea of delivering Indigenous content has a higher value when you include the Indigenous community, local Indigenous community. And then another thing was increased support during the on-campus residency component. And for all students, home life is so valued, and it's hard to leave home to come to do the intensives. And so the whole idea of increasing the support is just having, like, the Indigenous Education and Student Support Services, having them available. They were available, but having them more available for direct contact. And then appropriate response training of instructors to enhance the relationship between the instructors and the cohort. This is just more about when situations arise, how can the instructors appropriately respond to support Indigenous students. So that was also taken up. I will pass it over. Oh, sorry, I'll go over the summary of conclusions. So what all of that led to was that Indigenous content presented in an informed way, reflected throughout the readings, delivery methods, and conversation, provides the intellectual space for Indigenous students to exchange knowledge in a relevant way. Instructors with knowledge and understanding of Indigenous specific histories are better equipped to foster relationships between instructors and cohort members. This supports the emotional space and reciprocal relationships. Awareness and access to Indigenous imagery demonstrates respect for Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing, and contributes to the physical space for Indigenous students to connect with in a meaningful manner with the supports, people, and places. Interweaving space that responds to the intellectual, emotional, and physical needs helps students nurture their own spiritual space. And it's our own spiritual space that we are most protective of. One of the other things that came out as a conclusion was that in navigating the two worlds between culture and academy, Indigenous students translate Western context into Indigenous perspectives and back again, seeing the parallel between the two worlds. But this really only came out through the one-on-one discussions. And so that was really interesting for me, that even the phrasing of two worlds was brought up a lot within the one-on-one discussions. So now I'll turn it over to Wanda to discuss the offered guidance and recommendations.
Thank you, Christine. So I'll just remind of a couple of the objectives that were mentioned early on. And these included developing new approaches to supporting Indigenous students and identifying appropriate directions for curriculum development, which also would entail enhancing the overall learning experience for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. So leading from that, there are four, let's say, categories of recommendations that emerged from the research. These include, number one, expand Indigenous student support. Number two, develop and update Indigenous course content. 3, improve instructor and on-campus preparedness. And 4, increase visibility of Indigenous cultures. So I'll explain those a little bit here. Christine has gone over these during the discussion on the summary and conclusions, but I'll draw out what specifically the recommendations are. And I'll use the word should because ultimately these are the things that should be considered and done where possible. So first off, with expanding Indigenous student support, Royal Roads University should expand Indigenous students to support, for example, through student counseling services, and ensure that they are adequate to respond immediately to all Indigenous students, provided by a dedicated team representing all genders. And then another recommendation or sub-recommendation for expanding student support would be to have a traditional healer available to provide cleansing practices. And this could, there's many ways, but this could include examples such as for cedar brushing. And this emerged as extremely important, especially for when students come onto campus and do reflective activities that are part of on-campus experiences and where students need that extra support. And this should actually be offered as optional to both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students. And then the healer should obviously be in a position to explain and complete the entire practice or practices. And then another sub-recommendation to the first is having a dedicated Indigenous curriculum development staff. I'll speak a little bit more about that in a moment. And the last sub-recommendation here is that Royal Roads University should explore opportunities for Indigenous student mentoring for all Indigenous students. The second key recommendation drawn from the conclusions that Christine just elaborated on, again, is develop and update Indigenous course content. And so with that, all Royal Roads programs should review the current reading lists and placement of Indigenous content. And so what we mean by content placement is that Indigenous content should be appropriately positioned, such as on Moodle, so as to avoid demoting its importance. So it's all equal in access. And it's also recommended that the schools and instructors are aware of the gaps between the disciplines that are without Indigenous content, and for the need for connections to and case studies, especially of Indigenous ways of knowing and knowledge. So many more case studies could be brought in that are specific also to the disciplines and relevant then for the students. And this should be done in collaboration with an Indigenous curriculum development staff. What we what we recommend as a recommendation here too is having an annual review of course content. So not just putting Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing as a one-time exercise, but something that is done consistently and regularly so that the content continues to be relevant and also transformational. And that annual review would also provide an opportunity for faculty and also students to evaluate how the content landed with both Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, so that changes could be made so that the course remains relevant and transformational. The third recommendation, improving instructor and on-campus preparedness. At a minimum, Royal Roads University should require all instructors to have cultural safety training related to Indigenous peoples. And this is actually already available at SANYAS, and the website for that is http://2 and then that's www.sanyas.ca. And Royal Roads should request elder in residence services to be available during all on-campus residencies as another support, in addition to the one I mentioned earlier for students when they're on campus. And we've actually begun that in the School of Leadership, where we did have someone available, and it's very early to report back what that experience was, but informally we've had wonderful feedback around how critical the support has been. And lastly, number 4, increased visibility of Indigenous culture. This is quite a significant finding, and also then therefore recommendation, as this came up quite often. And Royal Roads University should then create, or co-create rather, a walk of the lands with and by the local Indigenous community to story land usage, pre-colonial knowledge in order to balance the castle tour that we currently offer. And so what was reported with that during the data collection phase was that Indigenous students felt upon arrival that there was a stark contrast between the different structures, the physical representation of the colonial structures, and also a gap between the land acknowledgement and these structures themselves. And so offering alternative ways to view the land may level the information of the land. Another sub-recommendation here is that Royal Roads University should display Indigenous art pieces, and that can be throughout the campus. And that could include sculptures, paintings, murals, and the like. And with that, the university could find creative ways to include Indigenous art pieces through students, for example, or perhaps the university could work with local art galleries to negotiate a loan of local Indigenous art pieces, and these could be displayed for a time throughout campus. And lastly, as a sub-recommendation here, for culture, the communications department should regularly feature Indigenous student successes. And with that, I'll hand it back over to my colleagues. Thank you very much.
Great, thanks, Wanda. This is Kathy Bishop again. And yeah, there's just one thing before we sort of delve into sharing some stories. I do just want to highlight that the word should was used. I also want to acknowledge Christine's use of guidance offered, and to really highlight that any recommendations need to be taken within their context, with the recognition that there are different ways these recommendations may already be being done, or in process of being done, or could be done, and that the resources, peoples, and funds needed to support are always important to consider, to take implementations to take recommendations into full implementation. And so, I mean, that brings us to us sharing some stories, and there's a title that currently in articles under review, a peer review articles under review, that Christine and myself have forwarded around relational aspects of Indigenous knowledge in higher education. And part of that was because through this process, we realized the importance of collegiality and talking things through and working with all those people who are involved, our co-investigators, our Heron people, other people in that process, but of course the students and alumni. And so just wanted to sort of give you that resource is forthcoming in terms of that we also recognized sort of a pre, during, and post pieces of what had happened. And I'd like to sort of speak to something that sort of after this all came to pass, after the completion of Christine's master's journey. Christine and I did consider how we'd continue the relationship, because the research work really provided a strong foundation for us to move forward and develop a new relationship. And so we've attended conferences and are looking at co-publishing. But this brings back to sort of, you know, one of the initial concerns that Elizabeth was bringing up was around, you know, how to move forward both Indigenous and non-Indigenous people together on this path. And so, you know, one of the concerns that I had was any lingering power over dynamics that are inherent in a student and supervisor relationship, and how to shift that into a new collegial relationship. And so again, if you're wondering, okay, but how do we, you know, move forward in this journey, I really invite you to consider the way that we all move forward. Was the key really was dialogue. We talk things through, head, heart, hand, and spirit. And I know for me, one of the things shifted because I had struggled with, you know, how do I sort of move in this process with Christine, who's also taking a lead in the process, but also recognizing she's a student in this process, was when Christine had said to me, you know, walking this journey is a process, and it really is about the willingness to lead, follow, and walk side by side. And so I think that's, if as people we can get to a point where we trust each other and that things will get done in the right way and the right time, then we can show up as our authentic selves. And when things get tricky, or we stumble, or we make some mistakes, then we can actually come forward and have honest conversations about that. So that was sort of the ending of sort of after the research, but it started even in the beginning. And this is where I was speaking earlier to the ethics application, that one of the concerns raised by you know, Railroad's Office of Research Services was the question of intellectual property. Who owned the data? And, you know, after various meetings with Christine and Elizabeth and Wanda and members of research services, the question of intellectual property was resolved by recognizing that the Indigenous Alumni Survey data belonged to the Indigenous Alumni Survey research team, hence why you saw that opening research questions were identified, question was identified, and then any data collected beyond that belonged to Christine. So you can see how we were seeking to navigate that process, and recognizing that, you know, as an academic supervisor, I was quite, you know, cognizant of my power over role, and not wanting to, you know, as Pete talks about, unfairly burdening our Indigenous students to show us the way too, that it is the onus is on us to also step up and learn from Indigenous colleagues and other services and other people in the process as we move forward to support and forward raising consciousness of Indigenous ways of knowing, doing, and being. And the only other thing that I'd like to add in here, just to offer up around during the process, was again, the dialogue was really, rooted in aligning our values too. And so that how we dialogue came in many different ways: email, phone, video conferencing, in person. And so again, there were moments when, through our values alignment, we were able, with our dialogues that were rooted in curiosity and respect for the knowledge that each other contributed, in terms of as a faculty having the expertise within the academy, but also Christine's expertise within the community, that we could then move and flow with those sort of pieces. And so, there were some really lovely moments that we were able to share some of those stories. And I think at this point, I'd like to turn it over to Christine if there's something that pops more for you that you would like to share, and then as well as to my colleagues Elizabeth and Wanda as well.
Sure thing. Thanks for that, Kathy. I think one of the important things for me to begin with was that I had already, with my previous attempts at higher education, I had already come into Royal Roads University with a set of tools that I had developed to be successful within the academy. And as you just mentioned, open dialogue was one of the key things that I took with me as a strategy to success. And having faculty members that are open to receiving curiosity, receiving feedback, receiving whatever it is that I wanted to approach with was valuable. So I think that as I look at this part, both for other Indigenous students, is to be able to bring your whole self into the academy means being able to express yourself to those faculty members. And you can find a way that sits well with you, like emails. As Kathy mentioned, I emailed a lot, and I used to begin it with like, this is just an FYI. Like I didn't need her to respond, but here's where I'm sitting at with this particular item. Or, if it was still sitting with me, and it was really about processes that had to align with our values, my values, her values. And so if it didn't get resolved, we talk about it. We had Skype meetings, we had in-person meetings, and we really just dialogued about what it meant for me and what our intentions were in bringing it. And it was such a great thing to be able to journey with open faculty member. And it just, how you receive the information, you might not need to do anything with it, but taking it and using it to better the relationship will help Indigenous students, I think. And there's many other stories that occurred in the during parts that I'm happy to share, but are also included in the article that Kathy and I co-authored. There's I think I'll just share one more, and that was in particular about the during piece of the journey, and it was in regards to gifting. This was one of the topics that came up. I had gifted elders for hearing my presentation, and in community, where I'm from, they generally prefer it to be handmade goods from those in community. If you can't do it yourself, we got it from our sister who did this, or our grandmother who made that, and we gift in that kind of meaningful way. Not to say that there's no meaningful way in gifting, but that was different than the advice that they had received from outside the school. And so we had to talk that through. What does it, gifting from an Indigenous student within the community, gifting from Royal Roads University faculty member, what do all of those look like? And so we had a great discussion about what that was from an Indigenous perspective, what it was from a non-Indigenous perspective, and we worked our way through, and that was really great because it was a tricky one, but we got there. So yeah. In the interest of not talking too much, if I can open it up to Elizabeth or Wanda.
I think we're probably about out of time, so I'm happy to leave it there. Anything, Wanda?
Thank you, everyone. I think we're out of time as well, so I'll leave it there as well. Thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much, everyone. Was this last slide something you wanted to speak to?
Well, I would say it's just our final slide in terms of
sorry.
this. No, thanks for that, Vanessa. I mean, I think it's just a quick call to action. I mean, we like any kind of research project, especially at Royal Roads, it really is around change, and so we really do invite people to sort of seek out their answers to this question. How can I and we enhance the overall learning experience at RRU for Indigenous and non-Indigenous students, including Indigenous ways of being, doing, and knowing, and let you know that there is a final report where any of us would be happy to have further conversations if you have any questions or comments or want to engage. Any one of us would be happy for people to reach out, and just again thank you for all that you're already doing and for your interest, for being on the call today.
Okay, thank you so much, Christine, Kathy, Elizabeth, and Wanda. That was wonderful, and I know I won't be alone in thinking that it's given me a lot to think about in terms of organizational change, in terms of Indigenous culture and support, and also of methodology and methods and processes. So thank you, and thank you for offering to for people to get in touch. I can offer our research services email if that works. It's researchservices@royalroads.ca, and I'd be happy to put you in touch with the presenters